I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage. Whatever I want, I get. Whatever I want, I fucking get.
Today, Sunday, January 18, 2026, is a very bad day for Sean Diddy Combs. Not because of a court ruling, not because of a press conference, not because of a headline fighting for attention, but because Netflix released something quietly. And at this level, quiet is never accidental. There was no countdown, no teaser, no trailer rolling across social media, no interviews setting expectations. Part 2 just appeared. 3 episodes, no explanation, no guidance. And when a story like this moves without noise, it isn't chasing viewers. It's addressing people who already understand what it means. This doesn't feel like entertainment. It feels like timing. Back in December, when the first documentary dropped, the reaction was immediate. 4 parts, carefully structured, a rise, an empire, allegations, a federal investigation closing in. Footage filmed just days before indictment. It felt definitive, heavy, final. The industry reacted fast, then slowed. Statements were issued, then carefully stopped. Names went quiet, conversations cooled. Most people assumed the story had reached its peak. But stories like this don't end when attention fades. They wait. This new release doesn't reintroduce the narrative. It doesn't recap. It doesn't explain. It assumes you remember what you already saw, and more importantly, what you didn't. That alone tells you who this chapter is really for. Instead of loud accusations, the tone is restrained. Instead of dramatic narration, everything slows down. Moments linger. Clips run longer than they usually would. Silence stretches. The absence of explanation becomes louder than any statement ever could. You start noticing how familiar scenes feel different now. Comments that once sounded harmless carry weight. Moments that once felt isolated start lining up. And the timing matters. This didn't drop during a quiet phase. It arrived after legal consequences already exist, after verdicts, after sentencing, while appeals remain pending and civil cases continue quietly in parallel. Against that backdrop, every old clip feels current again. Every pause feels intentional. Silence at this stage isn't neutral, it becomes part of the material. Before going deeper into this video, make sure to like this video, subscribe our channel and hit the bell icon. That's why I never miss any update like this. Now let's get back. What makes this chapter feel different is where the camera chooses to stay. There's far less focus on public-facing moments. No red carpets, no award speeches, no polished interviews. Instead, attention drifts toward in-between spaces, after parties, private rooms, conversations that happen just before cameras were supposed to stop rolling. The kinds of moments that usually get cut, not because they're explosive, but because they become revealing when placed in the wrong order. And order is everything here. The same faces appear across different years, the same environments, the same energy, the same confidence, even as circumstances change. When repetition like that keeps appearing without explanation, it stops feeling random. What's unsettling is how little guidance the documentary offers. Long stretches pass without commentary. You're shown who was present, where they were, and how often these configurations repeat. No conclusions are drawn on screen. But your mind starts drawing them anyway, because once events are stacked together instead of spaced years apart, the gaps disappear. And without gaps, forgetting becomes difficult. This also forces you to look back at December differently. The first documentary felt complete at the time, a 4-part arc that seemed to close the story. But even then, there were moments that felt unfinished, scenes that cut away just as tension built. Questions acknowledged but never returned to. Names appearing briefly, then vanishing. It was easy to explain that away then. Legal limits, editorial choices, time. Those explanations feel weaker now, because this new release doesn't arrive as a continuation. It arrives as a repositioning, It doesn't restate the rise or repeat the allegations. It assumes you already know that story. Instead, it brings back the moments that once felt like footnotes and places them at the center without comment. You begin to realize the first documentary wasn't about closing the door. It was about opening it. This chapter removes the comfort of time. Past footage sits next to present restraint. Old confidence is placed beside new caution. When that happens, the story changes shape. You stop asking what happened. You start asking why certain things were allowed to fade. And that question doesn't need answers to feel heavy. It only needs alignment. By the time this stretch ends, something has already shifted. You're no longer watching to see what happens next. You're watching to see how people move now that the room feels different. That shift is subtle, but it's irreversible. Because once awareness replaces reaction, the story can't go back to what it was. What changes everything in this chapter is not the scale of what's shown, but how it's shown. There is no voice telling you what to think, no captions guiding interpretation, no dramatic framing pushing you toward outrage. Instead, the documentary does something far more unsettling. It lets material exist on its own. Video clips appear without context. Call recordings play without commentary. Images surface without labels. Party footage lingers longer than expected. Planning conversations are heard without conclusions. Nothing is introduced as evidence. Nothing is dismissed as irrelevant. And that restraint is intentional. Because when information isn't explained, the mind starts organizing it on its own. You stop reacting to moments and start noticing patterns. You begin to recognize repetition instead of coincidence. Familiar faces reappear across different years, different locations, different circumstances, always close enough to matter. The documentary never says, "This means something." It lets proximity do that work. What feels different immediately is how compressed everything becomes. Events that once felt safely separated by time now sit side by side. Old confidence is placed next to present silence. Casual remarks from years ago are heard against the weight of what exists now. And once that distance collapses, the comfort disappears. Distance was always the buffer. Time softened memory, spacing reduced pressure. This chapter removes all of it. You start recognizing how often the same environments repeat, the same private settings, the same tone, the same ease, even as consequences change around them. When that repetition continues without explanation, it stops feeling accidental. Then there's the response outside the screen. There's no loud rebuttal, no aggressive denial, no attempt to drown the release in counter noise. Instead, there's restraint, carefully worded statements, silence where clarification would normally appear, a posture that feels less like defense and more like waiting. If none of this carried weight, waiting wouldn't be necessary. This is where the documentary becomes quietly heavy. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't shock. It slows everything down and lets moments sit longer than comfort allows. And sitting changes how things are felt. You start hearing tone differently. Pauses feel intentional. Smiles feel rehearsed. Not because the footage changed, but because the context did. This chapter doesn't try to reopen legal arguments. It doesn't summarize charges or revisit verdicts. It assumes you already know that ground. And that assumption alone tells you how confident the material is. The focus isn't on what happened in court, it's on what surrounded it. Behavior before scrutiny, behavior after consequences, behavior when visibility narrowed, but influence remained intact. And silence becomes the bridge between all of it. Not silence as absence, but silence as discipline. Discipline in what's addressed, discipline in what's avoided, discipline in stopping just short of clarity. That discipline repeats across years, across pressures, across situations. Repetition doesn't need proof to feel real. It just needs consistency. By now, the viewer isn't watching for revelations. They're watching for alignment, for how past behavior sits beside present restraint, for how narratives adapt when scrutiny doesn't fade, but matures. This is no longer about shock. It's about recognition. Recognition that some stories weren't finished, they were paused. Recognition that attention didn't disappear, it was redirected. Recognition that silence didn't mean resolution, it meant strategy. And once that recognition settles in, it doesn't leave when the screen goes dark. Because now every old clip feels current. Every new silence feels deliberate. Every future move will be read against everything that's already been seen. That's the real weight of this chapter. Not that it tells you something new, but that it rearranges everything you thought you already understood. By the time this chapter settles into its rhythm, something subtle but important starts to surface. The story stops being about what's included and starts being about what happens around it. Because footage can always be debated. Recordings can be contextualized. Images can be dismissed as moments frozen in time. But behavior is harder to explain away. What the documentary begins to reveal, without ever pointing directly at it, is how responses evolve once awareness replaces comfort. How posture changes when scrutiny becomes permanent. How language tightens. How engagement narrows. You start noticing how carefully everything is handled now. Statements don't disappear. They shrink. Visibility doesn't vanish. It becomes selective. Questions aren't rejected. They're acknowledged broadly, then left unresolved. At first, this feels subtle, easy to overlook. Then it repeats, and repetition changes how it's read. This isn't panic, it's calibration. Calibration only happens when the cost of being careless becomes too high. The documentary lets this play out without commentary. It places older moments beside present restraint and lets the contrast do the work. Confidence from the past sits next to caution in the present, not to accuse, but to show how pressure reshapes behavior over time. And once you see that shift, it's difficult to ignore. Time didn't resolve the story, pressure reorganized it. This is where the viewer starts understanding that the narrative didn't collapse when attention peaked. It adapted. Influence didn't disappear when consequences arrived. It recalibrated. Instead of dominating space publicly, it learned to manage distance quietly. Distance becomes the signal. Appearances feel fewer. Language feels safer. Engagement stops just before specificity would be required. Nothing here is framed as guilt. It's framed as control. Control over timing, control over tone, control over how much context is ever allowed to exist in one place. The documentary doesn't accuse anyone of orchestrating this. It simply shows how often the same response pattern appears under different circumstances. When scrutiny rises, clarity doesn't expand. It narrows. When pressure increases, engagement becomes disciplined, and discipline leaves fingerprints. You begin to notice how often time is relied on to soften questions instead of answer them, how pauses are used as insulation, how silence is framed as patience, dignity, or maturity, even when it appears at the same moments again and again. That repetition matters because repetition turns coincidence into pattern. The emotional tone shifts here, but not toward anger, toward inevitability, the sense that this isn't a story spiraling out of control. It's a story being managed carefully, step by step, and management only exists when there's something to manage. By now, the viewer isn't asking whether the material is damaging. They're asking why the response looks the way it does, why engagement stops where it stops, why certain questions never receive follow-up, even as time passes. Those questions don't demand proof. They demand explanation, and explanation is exactly what's missing. The documentary allows that absence to sit. It doesn't rush to fill it. It trusts the viewer to feel the weight of what isn't being said. To notice how often silence arrives not at the beginning of controversy, but at the precise moment where alignment would force accountability. This is where awareness replaces curiosity. You're no longer watching to see what happens next. You're watching to see how people move now that the room feels different. And once the room changes, instinct takes over. Instinct chooses caution over clarity, distance over explanation, time over resolution. The documentary doesn't challenge that instinct, it observes it, and sustained observation changes everything. As this chapter deepens, the story stops expanding outward and starts closing in. Not on a single moment, not on a single clip, but on the space between them. The documentary begins to rearrange time. Old footage no longer lives safely in the past. It's placed next to present restraint. Statements once delivered with ease now sit beside silence. Confidence that once felt natural is contrasted with caution that feels deliberate. And contrast changes everything. When moments are separated by years, almost anything can be explained away. Growth, change, misunderstanding. But when those same moments are placed side by side, explanations lose their flexibility. What once felt like evolution starts to feel like adjustment. Adjustment to pressure, adjustment to awareness, adjustment to consequences. The documentary never says this outright. It doesn't need to. It allows the viewer to feel how energy shifts once scrutiny becomes constant, how freedom tightens without being announced, how language becomes technical instead of expressive, how visibility becomes selective instead of open. This isn't chaos, it's calibration. Calibration happens quietly. It doesn't call attention to itself. It's designed to look natural. But when you see it repeated across different moments, different pressures, different years, it becomes recognizable. You start noticing how often answers stop just short of meaning something, how statements sound complete until you realize they resolve nothing, how concern is acknowledged without ever being anchored to a decision or a moment. Incompleteness appears again and again. At first it feels like an oversight, then it feels intentional, because when the same gaps appear repeatedly, they stop feeling accidental. They start feeling structural. The documentary leans into that structure. It doesn't rush to fill the silence. It lets it stretch long enough to become uncomfortable. Long enough for you to realize that silence isn't empty. It's active. It delays. It buffers. It protects space. And space has always been where influence operates most effectively. This is where the story stops feeling personal and starts feeling systemic. It's no longer about individual choices in isolation. It's about how environments respond when attention doesn't behave the way it's supposed to. Attention usually burns out. Outrage usually fades. Time usually wins. But this time, attention changed shape. It became quieter, steadier, more patient. The documentary mirrors that shift. It doesn't chase emotion. It trusts memory. It understands that once viewers begin comparing moments instead of reacting to them, the narrative becomes permanent. You begin to see how often accountability is discussed in theory, but never located in practice. How responsibility floats without landing. How consequences exist, yet explanations remain distant. Nothing collapses here. Nothing explodes. Everything holds tightly. And that tension is heavier than any dramatic reveal. By now, the viewer understands that what's unfolding isn't meant to provoke outrage. It's meant to sharpen awareness, to train the eye to notice pattern over moment, to recognize how power adapts when it's no longer invisible. Because power rarely disappears when questioned. It becomes quieter, more careful, more deliberate. And once you see that shift, you can't unsee it. The story no longer asks you to believe anything. It asks you to observe. And observation doesn't end when the screen goes dark. By the time this story reaches this point, something important has already happened. The audience has stopped waiting for answers. Not because answers wouldn't matter, but because the way they've been withheld has already changed how everything is read. When explanations are delayed long enough, silence stops feeling temporary. It starts feeling intentional. And intention is where meaning settles. This is where the documentary's weight becomes unmistakable. Nothing new needs to be revealed anymore. The power now comes from alignment, from seeing how past moments sit beside present behavior, from noticing how reactions shrink as awareness grows, from recognizing that the loudest part of the story is no longer what's said, it's what's avoided. You can feel how carefully the future is being approached now. Every appearance feels measured. Every statement feels filtered. Every absence feels like a decision. Not because panic exists, but because exposure does. Exposure doesn't always come from evidence. Sometimes it comes from comparison, from watching how posture changes once the room feels different, from seeing how ease gives way to caution without anyone acknowledging the shift. This is where influence reveals its limits. When power moves without being observed, it's flexible. When it's watched closely, it tightens. It becomes disciplined. It starts choosing safety over clarity, patience over explanation. That choice repeats across different moments, across different pressures, across different stages of consequence. And repetition is never neutral. You start noticing how often time is used as a shield instead of a solution. how distance replaces engagement, how silence is framed as maturity, even when it consistently arrives at the same moments. Right before clarity would force alignment. That consistency is unsettling because it suggests that this isn't about uncertainty, it's about containment. Containment of narrative, containment of context, containment of how much can ever be seen together at once. The documentary doesn't call this out. It doesn't need to. It trusts the viewer to recognize what happens when explanations are always just out of reach, when accountability is acknowledged abstractly but never anchored specifically. This is where curiosity gives way to recognition. You're no longer watching to learn something new. You're watching to see if anything breaks pattern. And that's a far more powerful position, because once patterns are visible, they don't require reinforcement. Every future move either confirms them or strains against them. Either way, they remain active. The story no longer needs escalation. It has gravity. Gravity doesn't rush. It doesn't peak. It pulls, slowly, consistently, relentlessly. By now, the viewer understands that this narrative isn't being driven by outrage or shock. It's being driven by memory, by the quiet accumulation of moments that never fully resolved, now stacked too close together to ignore. And memory doesn't forget just because the screen goes dark. This is the point where the story stops belonging to documentaries, statements, or releases. It belongs to perception. And perception, once changed, doesn't reset. It follows every future appearance, every pause, every carefully chosen word. That's the real consequence of this chapter. Not collapse, not explosion, but permanence. At this point, the story has fully crossed a line it can't step back over. Not because of anything dramatic that happened on screen, but because of what's now impossible to unsee. Once moments are aligned this way, the mind stops treating them as isolated. They become reference points, benchmarks. Every future detail gets measured against them automatically, without effort. That's when control becomes fragile. Because control depends on attention behaving predictably, on people reacting, then moving on time doing the work of softening memory. But what's happening now is different. Attention isn't loud anymore. It's steady. And steady attention doesn't exhaust itself. It watches. You can feel how the posture around the story has shifted. There's hesitation where there used to be comfort. Distance where there used to be familiarity. Precision where there used to be ease. These aren't accidents. They're adjustments made in response to awareness. Awareness doesn't accuse. It observes. And observation changes behavior long before confrontation ever does. This is the phase where silence stops being passive. It becomes active management, a way to avoid adding new material that could be compared, replayed, or aligned with what already exists. Because comparison is the real threat now. Comparison strips insulation, it removes context excuses, it collapses timelines. When people begin replaying the past with present awareness, the story rewrites itself without anyone touching it. Jokes don't sound the same. Confidence doesn't land the same way. Familiar patterns become visible instead of comfortable. That's why everything feels slower now. Slowness is intentional. Slowness reduces risk. Slowness limits exposure. But slowness also draws attention to itself. Every delayed response feels heavier. Every non-response feels deliberate. Every carefully chosen word sounds like it was chosen because it had to be. This isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about posture under pressure, and posture tells its own story. The documentary doesn't need to say this out loud. It lets the viewer sit with the tension of recognition, with the realization that nothing being shown exists on its own anymore. Everything has history now. Everything has context. That's when the narrative becomes self-sustaining. It doesn't need new clips. It doesn't need new releases. It doesn't need escalation. It lives in anticipation. In the awareness that every future move will be watched differently, that every appearance will be weighed, that every silence will be interpreted. This is where the real pressure exists, not in headlines, not in statements, but in memory. Memory doesn't shout, it waits. And waiting changes the balance of power. Because once people stop reacting and start remembering, the story no longer belongs to whoever is trying to manage it. It belongs to context. And context is unforgiving. From here on, nothing happens in isolation. Every new moment will carry the echo of what came before it. Every attempt to move forward will be read through a lens that can't be turned off. That's the shift that's already taken place. Quiet, permanent, and impossible to reverse. By now, the story doesn't need momentum anymore. It has weight. And weight changes how everything moves. Nothing here feels rushed. Nothing feels accidental. The absence of urgency isn't calm, it's calculation. When a narrative slows this much, it's because speed has become dangerous. Speed creates mistakes. Speed creates material. And material is exactly what no one wants added right now. So everything tightens. You can sense it in how carefully the future is being approached. Not just in what's said, but in what's avoided. Not just in appearances, but in how rare they've become. This isn't retreat, it's risk management. Because once awareness settles in, the rules change. Before, attention was loud. Loud attention burns out. It argues, it reacts, it forgets. But quiet attention is different. Quiet attention doesn't need new information. It revisits old information with a sharper lens. It remembers. It compares. And comparison is relentless. Every old moment now exists in a new environment. Statements once made casually now sound deliberate. Pauses that once felt natural now feel strategic. Even neutrality feels like a choice. This is where influence begins to feel pressure without being challenged directly. No one is forcing answers. No one is demanding explanations. They're just watching. Watching how long silence lasts. Watching where engagement stops. Watching which topics are approached broadly and which are never touched at all. That observation alone is enough to change behavior. You can feel how much effort is going into not creating new reference points. Because reference points are how patterns get confirmed. And once a pattern is confirmed, it doesn't need commentary to stay alive. This is why everything sounds careful now. Why language feels engineered to survive replay. Why statements feel designed to say something without saying anything that could be placed next to the past. The past is no longer behind this story, it's beside it. And that's uncomfortable, because when the past sits beside the present, it exposes continuity. It shows what changed and what didn't. It reveals how often responses follow the same shape under different pressures. That's when familiarity stops feeling safe. The documentary doesn't push this realization. It trusts that once the audience reaches it, it won't leave. Because conclusions reached quietly tend to be the most durable. By now, the viewer isn't looking for revelations. They're looking for deviation, for anything that breaks the pattern, for any moment that doesn't fit the established rhythm. And when nothing does, the pattern strengthens. This is the phase where narratives don't collapse. They settle. They harden into something that doesn't require reinforcement. They become the lens through which everything else is seen. From here on, silence won't be read as absence. It will be read as posture. Every pause will mean something. Every distance will be interpreted. Every return will be examined. That's the cost of awareness. And once awareness reaches this level, it doesn't fade when attention moves elsewhere. It travels with the story. It follows it into every future moment. That's why this chapter feels heavier than anything before it. Not because it's louder, but because it's inescapable. At this stage, the story has stopped asking to be believed. It's asking to be remembered. Because remembrance is where things become permanent. What's happening now isn't driven by new revelations. It's driven by how the old ones refuse to settle. They keep resurfacing, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, like background noise you can't tune out once you notice it. That persistence changes everything. You start realizing that nothing moving forward will ever be neutral again. Every future moment will arrive already framed, already contextualized, already compared against what's been aligned here. This is where narratives usually hope fatigue will win, where the expectation is that people will move on, get distracted, lose interest. But fatigue only works when attention is emotional. And what's happening now isn't emotional, it's analytical. Analytical attention doesn't burn out. It sharpens. You can feel how much effort is being put into minimizing exposure. Not in obvious ways, but in subtle ones. Fewer words, broader language, less specificity, the kind of communication designed to survive scrutiny without ever satisfying it. That tells you something important, because when clarity is safe, it's offered. When it's risky, it's delayed. And delay has become a recurring theme. Delay in answers, delay in engagement, delay in closure. The documentary doesn't frame this as avoidance. It simply places it in sequence. It shows how often moments that could have resolved tension instead allowed it to linger. How often explanation was postponed until postponement became the pattern itself. That's when silence stops being ambiguous. It becomes directional. Directional silence points away from something. It creates space without explaining why that space is necessary. And when that happens repeatedly, the space itself becomes meaningful. You start noticing how often comfort appears in generalities, how frequently responsibility is discussed without ever being localized, how easily attention is redirected without ever being resolved. None of this is chaotic, it's controlled. And control at this level isn't about dominance, it's about endurance. Endurance through patience, endurance through restraint, endurance through letting time do what confrontation never could. But time is no longer behaving the way it used to. Instead of spacing moments apart, it's compressing them. Instead of dulling memory, it's sharpening it. Instead of allowing stories to fade, it's aligning them. And alignment changes the cost of silence. Silence used to feel like safety. Now it feels like exposure waiting. That's why everything feels measured. Why every future move feels like it's being weighed before it happens. Why even absence feels intentional. Because absence, once noticed, becomes information. The documentary doesn't push this realization. It lets it arrive naturally. It understands that once viewers start tracking patterns instead of moments, the narrative no longer needs help. It carries itself forward. By now, the audience isn't looking for confirmation. They're watching consistency. They're listening for echoes. They're noticing how often the same strategies appear under different circumstances. And once that recognition locks in, it doesn't unlock. The story doesn't escalate here. It settles deeper. It becomes part of how future silence is interpreted. Part of how future confidence is measured. Part of how future restraint is understood. This is where the real shift lives, not in outrage, not in reaction, but in the quiet understanding that something fundamental has changed, and there's no way to return to how it was seen before. By now, the story has reached a place where answers almost feel beside the point, not because answers wouldn't matter, but because the way they've been avoided has already reshaped the narrative. When explanations are delayed long enough, people stop expecting them. They begin reading everything else instead. That's when interpretation takes over. Silence no longer creates uncertainty. It creates meaning. Every pause feels intentional. Every non-response feels chosen. Every carefully worded statement feels designed to survive comparison rather than resolve anything. This is where the story becomes self-sustaining. No new footage is required. No new claims are necessary. No escalation is needed. The pressure exists on its own. Because once moments are aligned this way, the mind does the rest. It starts replaying the past automatically. Old clips surface without being shown. Previous statements echo without being repeated. Memory becomes active instead of dormant. That's dangerous territory for any narrative built on time and distance. Time used to create insulation. Distance used to soften edges. Silence used to feel like closure. Now all three work differently. Time compresses, distance disappears, silence amplifies. You can feel how carefully everything is being managed now. Not aggressively, not defensively, carefully, as if every future move is being evaluated not for impact, but for longevity, for how it will look months from now, years from now, when it's placed beside everything that already exists. This is no longer about reacting to a release. It's about surviving replay. Replay doesn't argue. It doesn't exaggerate. It simply places moments next to each other and waits. And waiting is where patterns reveal themselves. You begin to see how often engagement stops at the same boundary, how consistently clarity is acknowledged but never delivered, how frequently responsibility is referenced in theory but never anchored in detail. That consistency is unsettling because it removes randomness from the equation. This isn't chaos, it's structure, a structure that relies on patience, restraint, and the belief that people will eventually move on, that attention will drift, that curiosity will cool. But curiosity isn't what's driving this anymore. Recognition is. Recognition that responses follow the same shape. Recognition that silence arrives at the same moment. Recognition that explanations always seem just out of reach. Once recognition replaces curiosity, the balance changes. The story doesn't need new chapters. It doesn't need reinforcement. It lives inside perception now. Every future appearance will be measured. Every absence will be interpreted. Every statement will be weighed against what was never said before. This is where narratives stop being controlled by messaging and start being controlled by memory. And memory is patient. It doesn't demand immediate answers. It doesn't force confrontation. It simply keeps everything alive. By now, the viewer isn't watching to see what happens next. They're watching to see if anything breaks the pattern. And when nothing does, the pattern becomes the story. That's where this is settled. Not in shock, not in outrage, but in a quiet, enduring awareness that won't disappear when the screen goes dark. By the time this story reaches its final moments, nothing feels unresolved. Not because everything has been answered, but because everything has settled. There's no dramatic ending here, no statement that closes the door, no final reveal designed to shock, and that's intentional, because the most lasting impact of this story was never meant to be loud. It was meant to change how things are seen, not how they're argued. At this stage, the narrative no longer belongs to releases, interviews, or documentaries. It belongs to context, and context doesn't reset when attention shifts elsewhere. It stays active. It follows every future moment quietly without needing to announce itself. That's the after effect. Every appearance will feel measured. Every word will sound filtered. Every silence will carry intent. Not because anything new is being hidden, but because everything old is now visible at once. The power of this chapter was never in what it revealed. It was in how it aligned, in how moments that once lived far apart were placed close enough to touch, in how time stopped protecting behavior and started exposing pattern. Patterns don't accuse, they endure. And once a pattern is seen, it doesn't disappear just because the screen goes dark. This is where influence meets its limit, not through confrontation, but through awareness. Awareness that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, and doesn't fade. Awareness that simply watches and remembers. Memory is the real force here. Memory doesn't need updates. It doesn't need reinforcement. It only needs consistency. And consistency is exactly what has been placed in view. From this point forward, nothing exists in isolation anymore. Every future move will be read through the lens of what's already been aligned. Every pause will echo past silence. Every attempt to move on will be measured against what never fully resolved. That doesn't mean collapse, it means permanence. The story doesn't end. It locks in. It becomes part of how the narrative will always be understood. Even when no one is talking about it out loud. Even when attention moves elsewhere. Even when time passes. Because time no longer erases what's been seen, it preserves it. So when the screen goes dark, nothing feels finished. And that's the point. The conversation doesn't need to continue loudly. It only needs to be remembered. And now it will be. Even after everything that's been placed on the table, the story refuses to feel complete. And that's not a flaw. It's the point. Because real endings don't arrive with certainty. They arrive with awareness. And awareness has already taken hold. At this stage, nothing needs to be proven for the impact to exist. Proof belongs to courtrooms. What's happening here belongs to perception. And perception has its own gravity. Once it forms, it doesn't need permission to stay. You can feel how the center of attention has shifted. It's no longer fixed on individual moments or isolated clips. It's fixed on behavior over time, on consistency, on what repeats when circumstances change. Repetition is powerful, not because it accuses, but because it reveals what doesn't change. This is why future silence will never sound the same again. Silence used to feel neutral. Now it feels shaped, measured, chosen. Every pause will be weighed against past pauses. Every absence will be compared to earlier disappearances. Nothing gets the benefit of doubt anymore, only the benefit of memory. And memory is unforgiving in a quiet way. What's unsettling is how calm everything feels now. No rush to correct narratives, no urgency to clarify, just careful movement, controlled presence, strategic distance. That calm isn't confidence, it's containment. Containment of risk, containment of exposure, containment of anything that could collapse alignment, because alignment is what changed everything. Once moments are aligned instead of isolated, the story stops being fragile. It becomes durable. Durable stories don't rely on outrage to survive. They live on recognition alone. This is where influence realizes it's being watched differently. Not emotionally, not reactively, but structurally. People aren't asking what happened to him anymore. They're asking, why does this always look the same? That question doesn't go away. It follows. It follows into future projects, into future appearances, into future silence. And every time the same response appears, the question gets louder without making a sound. That's the pressure now. Not public backlash, not scandal, but expectation. Expectation that behavior will either break pattern or confirm it. The documentary never needed to say any of this out loud. It simply needed to let everything sit long enough for recognition to form. And once it does, the story no longer needs help carrying itself forward. It moves on its own, quietly, persistently, without losing shape. That's where this chapter leaves us. Not with conclusions, but with clarity. And clarity doesn't fade when attention shifts. It stays active, waiting, reshaping how everything that comes next will be understood. Because once a story reaches this stage, it doesn't end. It echoes. At this point, the story no longer feels like something unfolding in front of you. It feels like something that has already changed the room. Nothing dramatic is left to happen, and that's the most unsettling part. Because when a narrative reaches this stage, it doesn't rely on new information to stay alive. It survives on alignment, on memory, on the quiet recognition that certain patterns have now been seen too clearly to be ignored. This is where the weight settles, not in shock, not in outrage, but in understanding. Understanding that what mattered most was never a single clip, a single recording, or a single moment. It was the way those moments were allowed to sit together long enough to form shape, long enough to remove the comfort of distance, long enough to turn silence into information. Once that happens, the story stops needing momentum. It becomes part of how future events are read. Every appearance from here on will feel intentional. Every word will sound filtered. Every absence will feel deliberate. Not because anything new is being hidden, but because everything old is now active at the same time. That's the shift that can't be undone. The documentary doesn't end with answers, because answers were never the point. The point was awareness. And awareness doesn't disappear when attention moves on. It stays embedded in perception. Perception reshapes meaning. It changes how confidence is interpreted, how restraint is read, how silence is understood. What once felt neutral now feels directional. What once felt distant now feels connected. And once those connections exist, they don't need reinforcement. They don't need repetition. They don't need commentary. They live quietly in context. This is the phase where narratives stop being managed and start being carried by memory, where time no longer softens impact, but preserves it. Where moving forward doesn't erase the past, it brings it along. Nothing collapses here. Nothing explodes. Everything simply locks in. The audience isn't waiting for the next release anymore. They're watching reality itself with a different lens. And that lens doesn't turn off. Because once people stop reacting and start remembering, the story doesn't need to continue loudly to remain powerful. It only needs to exist. And now it does.